Alice was only 6 years old when she woke up in the middle of the night with a hand covering her mouth. It wasn't the first time, and she already knew, with the terrible wisdom that only abused children possess, that screaming wouldn't help at all. "If you tell anyone," whispered the voice that should have protected her, "no one will believe you. And if they do, it'll be much worse." For years, Alice lived in this silent nightmare. Normal school days, afternoons playing in the yard, nights that she tried to forget. She became two people: daytime Alice, who smiled and pretended everything was fine, and nighttime Alice, who died a little more each day. At 20, this same girl was dressed in white, walking toward the altar to marry the gentlest man she'd ever known. Radiant, in love, completely healed. How did a child who was broken in every possible way manage not only to survive, but to find a love so pure it healed wounds that seemed incurable? The journey between that terrified little girl and this victorious woman is one of the most powerful redemption stories you'll ever hear. And if you or someone you know has gone through trauma that seemed impossible to overcome, you need to hear every word of this story, because what Alice discovered will change your perspective on what's possible when you think you've lost everything. But I need to warn you, this story gets much heavier before it gets beautiful. And when you understand what Alice faced, the ending will move you even more. Chapter 1. Hell Disguised as Home. Alice's childhood took place in a house that, from the outside, looked absolutely normal. Well-kept garden, friendly neighbors, a family that went to church on Sundays. No one suspected the horror that happened behind those walls. The abuse began when Alice was too small to understand what was happening. It started as secret games that made her feel uncomfortable, but which she was taught to accept as normal. "This is what people who love each other do," said the person who should have been her protector. "But it's our special secret." Alice didn't know that other children didn't have special secrets like that. Didn't know that the constant fear she felt in her stomach wasn't normal. Didn't know that waking up in the middle of the night in panic was a sign that something was terribly wrong. What she did know was that when she tried to tell her mother what was happening, she was called a liar. Worse than that, she was punished for making up dirty stories about someone in the family. "Girls who lie about these things go to hell," her mother said, looking at her with a mixture of disgust and disappointment that cut deeper than any physical assault. Alice learned, in that moment, the most destructive lesson a child can learn: that her voice had no value, that her pain didn't matter, and that telling the truth was dangerous. The abuse continued for years, and Alice developed survival mechanisms that would haunt her into adulthood. She learned to dissociate during the worst moments, sending her mind away while her body suffered. She learned to be perfectly silent, perfectly obedient, perfectly invisible. She became an expert at predicting the moods of the adults around her. She could sense tension in the air before any word was spoken. She developed a painful sensitivity to danger signals that would make her jump at the slightest unexpected noise. At school, Alice was the quiet child who never caused trouble. Teachers praised her for being so well-behaved, not knowing this behavior was the result of pure terror. Alice had learned that drawing attention was dangerous, that being noticed meant being vulnerable. Chapter 2. The Performance of Normalcy. As Alice grew up, she became a consummate actress. She developed a frightening ability to appear normal on the outside while inside she was falling apart. She smiled at the right time, laughed at the right jokes, asked the right questions to deflect attention from herself. During adolescence, the physical abuse diminished, but the psychological damage was already done. Alice carried within herself an unshakable conviction that she was dirty, broken, worthless. She believed that anyone who truly knew her, who knew what had happened to her, would immediately reject her. At 15, Alice made a decision that, would shape the next years of her life. She would never marry, never have children, never allow anyone to get close enough to discover who she really was inside. "I'm a virus," she wrote in her diary on a particularly difficult night. "I contaminate everything I touch. It's better for me to stay alone forever than to spread this rot to other people." Alice looked at normal families with a mixture of longing and horror. Longing for the normalcy she'd never known. Horror at the possibility that she might one day become like the adults who had hurt her. The fear of repeating the cycle of abuse became an obsession. Alice had nightmares where she was screaming at a small child, where her own hands became weapons, where she saw terror in the eyes of someone who should feel safe with her. These nightmares were so vivid that she would wake up vomiting, convinced they were premonitions of an inevitable future. Chapter 3. The Fortress of Solitude. When Alice reached adulthood, she had built an emotional fortress around herself that was practically impenetrable. She had a job, her own apartment, a life that seemed functional from the outside. But inside, she was dying of loneliness. Alice became an expert at sabotaging relationships. Anyone who showed romantic interest in her was immediately analyzed and discarded. He laughed too loudly. Must be unstable. She was too affectionate. Must be hiding something. There was always an excuse, always a reason to keep her distance. She watched life happen to other people like someone watching a movie. She saw coworkers getting married, having children, building families, and felt a physical pain in her chest. It wasn't just envy. It was grief. Grief for a life she had decided she could never have. "I'm like a vampire," Alice thought. "I can only exist in the shadows, watching real life happen to normal people." The solitude that began as protection revealed itself to be a cruel prison. Alice was safe, yes, but she was dying inside. She didn't feel the sharp pain of abuse every day like when she was a child, but she also didn't feel joy, hope, or real connection with another human being. The silence of her apartment, which had once been her refuge, became deafening. She started leaving the TV on just to have voices in the house, even if they were from people she didn't know talking about subjects that didn't interest her. Chapter 4. The Breakdown. The day that changed everything started like any other. Alice was coming home from work by a different route when she decided to pass through the municipal park. It was an autumn afternoon, and she needed a few extra minutes outdoors before returning to the silence of her apartment. That's when she saw a family in the park. Father, mother, and a girl of maybe 5 years old, with golden curls that shone in the late afternoon light. The father was pushing his daughter on an old creaky swing. Each laugh from the child echoed through the park like pure music. The mother was sitting on a nearby bench, watching with a smile so genuine, so full of peace, that Alice felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. It wasn't just the family's happiness that shook her. It was the safety. The child on the swing wasn't afraid. She wasn't constantly checking her parents' moods. She wasn't walking on eggshells. She was simply being a child. Alice realized she had never felt safe that way, had never laughed without worrying about the consequences, had never just been a child. And in that moment, the entire fortress she had built crumbled all at once. 20 years of rigid control, of repressed emotions, of pain stored in her chest simply dissolved like a house of cards in a storm. Alice ran home and cried like she had never cried in her life. These weren't tears of ordinary sadness. They were 2 decades of grief for a childhood that had been stolen from her, for a life she had denied herself, for dreams she had buried before even allowing them to bloom. Chapter 5. The Silent Scream. That same night, moved by desperation that was greater than her fear, Alice did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She looked for help. She didn't know why her feet led her to a small church in her neighborhood. Alice wasn't religious. Her experience with church in childhood had been more about appearances and judgments than about love or acceptance. But at that moment, she wasn't looking for religion. She was looking for sanctuary. The church was empty and silent. Alice sat in the last pew, the one reserved for the lost, the desperate, those who need a quick exit. And there, in that sacred silence, she was finally completely honest about her pain. God, she whispered to the emptiness. I don't know if you exist. I don't know if you care. But I've reached my limit. The words poured out of her like a dam that had finally burst. I've spent my entire life trying to survive what they did to me when I was a child. And I survived. But this isn't living. This is just existing. Alice took a deep breath, her words echoing off the empty walls. I built a life that protects me from everything, but it's killing me inside. I'm so afraid of becoming like the people who hurt me that I refuse to live. If your love is real, if it's different from what I've known, then I beg, show me. I'm not asking to forget what happened. That's part of who I am. But give me a reason to believe there's still something good in the world, that there's still something good in me. In the silence that followed her desperate prayer, something changed. It wasn't dramatic. There were no heavenly lights or angelic choirs. It was subtle, like the difference between breathing with difficulty and breathing freely. And then, in the center of the chaos that was her mind, a certainty arose. It wasn't an audible voice, but it was clearer than any sound. I'm going to send you someone. Someone who will love you as you deserve to be loved, who will show you that not all love hurts, and who will help you discover that you're not broken. You're being prepared for something beautiful. Alice clung to that promise like a drowning person clings to a life preserver. It was all she had, but it was enough. Chapter 6. The Wait. The months that followed were a strange period for Alice. She hadn't become a completely different person overnight. She still carried all her wounds, still felt fear, still had nightmares, but something had changed in her perspective. For the first time in years, Alice began to pay attention to the people around her in a different way. She was no longer just looking for signs of danger or reasons to pull away. She was beginning to allow herself to see genuine goodness when it appeared. That's how she noticed Gabriel. He worked at the same company as Alice, but in a different department. She had seen him in the hallways hundreds of times, but had never really seen him until that day when she watched him helping a colleague who was clearly having a difficult day. The colleague had spilled coffee on her blouse and was almost crying, probably the last straw after a morning full of small catastrophes. Gabriel not only offered napkins, he gently suggested she use his jacket to cover the stain, and said no one would notice. Later, Alice saw Gabriel speaking with the same kindness to the building's doorman, an elderly gentleman whom most people ignored. She saw him holding doors for strangers, offering his place in the elevator, saying thank you to the cleaning person. Maybe, Alice thought, not all men are dangerous. Chapter 7. First Steps. The first encounter between Alice and Gabriel happened, completely naturally, in a situation she couldn't have planned even if she'd wanted to. Alice was at the Christian bookstore near work, a place she had started frequenting since that night in the church, when she literally bumped into Gabriel in the self-help book section. Sorry, they said at the same time, and then laughed at the synchronicity. It was a genuine laugh from Alice, something she hadn't done in a long time. Good books in this section, Gabriel commented, pointing to the book Alice was holding about emotional healing. I read that one. Changed my perspective on some things. Alice was surprised. Most people would avoid mentioning books about trauma or emotional healing, as if it were something embarrassing. But Gabriel spoke about it as naturally as he would about the weather. You went through something that needed healing? Alice asked, and immediately regretted the personal question. Gabriel smiled kindly. Everyone has something to heal, right? The difference is some people admit it and seek help. Others pretend everything's fine. They talked for almost an hour in that bookstore. Gabriel told her he had lost his father when he was a teenager, and that it made him go through a very difficult period of anger and questioning. Alice found herself sharing, very vaguely, that she'd had a complicated childhood and was learning to deal with it. When Gabriel suggested they have coffee sometime, Alice felt the familiar alarm go off in her mind, but this time she took a deep breath and said yes. Chapter 8. Learning to Trust. The first months of friendship between Alice and Gabriel were like an intensive course in how normal relationships work for her. Gabriel didn't pressure for personal information. He didn't get offended when Alice canceled plans at the last minute because she was having a particularly difficult day. He didn't try to fix her or give unsolicited advice. He was simply present when Alice finally told Gabriel, in a very summarized way, that she had suffered abuse in childhood. She prepared herself for all the reactions she had imagined over the years: pity, discomfort, judgment, or worse, the attempt to minimize her pain with phrases like, "That was a long time ago," or "You need to get over it." Instead, Gabriel said, "Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me that. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for you." And then, he changed the subject, following Alice's cue that she didn't want to talk more about it at that moment. It was the first time in Alice's life that someone had received the revelation of her trauma with grace and maturity, without making it the center of drama or a fix-it project. Slowly, very slowly, Alice began to lower her defenses around Gabriel. She began to respond to his messages without analyzing every word 3 times before sending. She began to suggest activities together, instead of always waiting for him to take the initiative. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved genuine friendship. Chapter 9. The First Storm. The first real argument between Alice and Gabriel happened after almost a year of friendship. It was about something completely trivial, where to have dinner on some random Friday. But for Alice, nothing about conflict was trivial. When Gabriel showed the first sign of frustration, a sigh a little louder than normal, and to Alice, "Can we just pick a place?" Alice's entire nervous system went into panic. Her body prepared for what she knew would come: the explosion, the screaming, maybe even physical violence. Alice instinctively cowered, closed her eyes, and waited for the impact. But what came was silence. When Alice opened her eyes, Gabriel was looking at her with an expression of deep understanding and sadness. "Alice," he said softly, "are you afraid of me right now?" Alice couldn't speak, just nodded. "Yes." Gabriel took a deep breath and sat on the floor, putting himself in a lower position than Alice to seem less threatening. "I will never, ever hurt you. Not physically, not emotionally, not in any way. And if I get frustrated about something, we'll talk about it like 2 people who care about each other. Okay?" Alice cried that day. She cried from relief, from fear, from gratitude, from confusion. She cried because for the first time in her life, someone had reacted to her vulnerability with compassion instead of taking advantage of it. Chapter 10. The Love That Heals. Over the next 3 years, Gabriel and Alice built a solid foundation of trust and true love. It wasn't an easy or linear process. There were setbacks, moments of panic, nights when Alice's nightmares returned with full force. But Gabriel remained. Through every crisis, every moment of fear, every time Alice tested his limits to see if he would finally give up on her, Gabriel remained. He learned to recognize when Alice was having an emotional trigger and knew exactly how to help her calm down without making her feel fragile or broken. He never used her past as a weapon during arguments. He never made her feel that her fears were irrational or exaggerated. Most importantly, Gabriel showed Alice that love could be safe. That conflict could be resolved without violence or cruelty. That she could be completely herself, wounds and scars included, and still be loved unconditionally. It was Gabriel who suggested Alice consider therapy, not because she was broken, but because she deserved to have every possible tool for healing. It was Gabriel who held her hand at the first appointment and waited outside the office. And it was Gabriel who, on a spring night 4 years after they met, knelt in the same church, where Alice had made her desperate prayer and asked her to marry him. "I know marriage is scary for you," he said, tears in his eyes. "I know your experience with family was terrible, but I want to spend the rest of my life proving that family can be different, that love can be different." Chapter 11. The Circle. Completes Alice and Gabriel's wedding took place exactly 5 years after that night in the empty church. It was a small but deeply meaningful celebration, held in the same church where Alice had cried out for hope. When Alice got dressed that morning, putting on the white dress she had sworn never to wear, she didn't see hypocrisy in the mirror. She saw redemption. The white didn't represent physical purity. It represented the purity of a heart that had been cleansed by God's love and the love of a good man. Walking down the church aisle toward Gabriel was like completing an epic journey. Each step was a declaration: I am no longer defined by what was done to me. I am defined by who I chose to become. The yes that Alice said at that altar echoed through every cell of her being. It was an answer to the yes that God had given to her desperate prayer years before. It was confirmation that she had not only survived her past, she had triumphed over it. Chapter 12. The New Life. Today, 1 month after the wedding, Alice lives a life she didn't even dare to dream when she was that terrified 6-year-old girl. Her mornings begin with the familiar sound of the coffee maker and Gabriel's comforting presence beside her. The nightmares still come occasionally, but now Alice no longer faces them alone. Gabriel holds her when she wakes up scared, whispers words of love and safety in her ear, and stays awake with her until she feels safe again. Alice has discovered the beauty of the ordinary. The evenings reading together in the living room, the mundane conversations about the workday, the discussions about where to hang a picture on the wall. These moments of normalcy are her greatest treasures. She began working as a volunteer at a support center for abused children. Her scars became her credentials. Her story of pain became her source of strength to help other people. Alice learned that Jesus didn't erase her wounds. He transformed them. The places that once hurt became sources of compassion. The memories that once haunted her now serve as reminders of how far she's come. Epilogue. The promise fulfilled. If you asked Alice today what she learned about overcoming, she would say it's not about forgetting the past. It's about not allowing the past to write your future. She learned that healing doesn't mean the wounds disappear. It means they stop bleeding. It means you can touch them without feeling pain. It means they become part of your victory story, not your defeat story. Alice discovered that safe love exists, that not all men are predators, that family can be a refuge, not a battlefield, that she wasn't destined to repeat the destructive patterns she knew in childhood. The girl who once thought she was too dirty to be loved now knows. She was loved all along, first by a God who saw her in her pain and decided to rewrite her story, and then by a man who saw her scars and called them battle wounds, evidence of her strength. The desperate prayer that Alice made in that empty church was answered more beautifully and completely than she ever dared imagine. God didn't just send someone to love her. He sent someone who would help her discover that she had always been worthy of love. This is living proof that no matter how dark the night, no matter how deep the wounds, no matter how impossible the situation seems, there is still hope. There is still healing. there is still the possibility of a happy ending. And if Alice could do it, so can you. Her story is a testimony that people are not defined by the worst that happened to them, but by the best they chose to become. It's proof that cycles can be broken, that wounds can become sources of strength, and that true love doesn't just exist. It transforms everything it touches. Alice was 6 years old when her world became hell. She's 20 now, and her world has become a living testimony that miracles happen. Not always dramatically, but always really. And this is just the first page of a much longer and more beautiful story that Alice and God are writing together, one day at a time.